Hello, World at War class, and welcome to Week 3, Module 1. Today we're going to talk about the American involvement in World War I. And I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but before World War I, we kind of kept our hands off the world. We did have the Spanish-American War of 1898. That really was the first time American power was used outside the borders of the United States. But after that, that was a pretty small war, a couple of years at the most, in places like the Philippines and other places. But after that, we were kind of like back to our own game of being an isolationist country, which means we just were not interested in what was going on in the world. We just were more focused on what was going on inside the borders of the United States. Now, Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, and he was the opposite of the previous big-name president, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a earthy guy. He liked to get dirty. He was out in the wilderness. He was a cowboy. He was in the army. He did a lot of things. He was blood and guts and that type of guy. Woodrow Wilson was a college professor type. In fact, he was a college professor and a college president as well. So he was more of a guy who thought about ideas. He liked to think about things. In fact, many think he was an idealist, meaning that he saw how the world should be. He looked at it as a thinking problem rather than a physical problem. So here's Woodrow Wilson. He gets elected in 1912. He does fine. The war begins in 1914, and the United States is not a part of it. In fact, we're happy not to be a part of it. Many of our corporations get rich by selling our friends, England and France, weapons and supplies for the war effort. So America is happy being out of the war. And so when Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election in 1916, his slogan is, "He kept us out of war." In other words, the whole world is in chaos and fighting each other. And that's a whole big mess over in Europe. But here in America and North America is Woodrow Wilson leading us by keeping us out of the war. And so most people were very happy with him. But then some things happened in 1917 that kind of changed things. First of all, in the beginning of the war, 1915, the Germans had this new weapon called submarines. And so they had begun to target ships coming from the United States to England and France and sinking them to stop the flow of supplies. One such ship that they sank just off the coast of Ireland was a ship called the Lusitania. And it was a cruise ship. It was just like the Titanic. And as it approached the United Kingdom, German submarines shot a couple torpedoes into it, and it sank in 20 minutes, killing almost 800 people, I think, on board, 100 and some Americans, 128 Americans, I believe, were killed there on the Lusitania. And Woodrow Wilson said, look, you can't do that. You can't be killing Americans no matter what we might be doing with our supplies. And the Germans kind of backed down and said, you're right. We will not kill Americans anymore on cruise ships heading to Europe. But in 1917, there was a whole different ballgame. The Germans were not doing well. They were running out of men and supplies, and something had to change in World War I if they were going to win. And one of the ways they saw in changing things was to starve the British out of the war. And so they announced and started up a new strategy called unrestricted submarine warfare. And they began shooting down every ship that they could find, including those owned, operated, and being ridden on by Americans. At about the same time, the British released a secret document that they had intercepted from the Germans to the Mexicans, promising support for Mexico if Mexico would attack the United States from the southern border. And if and when Mexico won that war, then Mexico would take back places like Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. And the idea was that if Mexico was fighting a war against the United States in North America, that the United States could not be fighting a war in Europe. Well, Mexico had no intention of ever going to a war against us. So this strategy was flawed from the beginning. And when the British gave this document to us, it angered Woodrow Wilson like he is hardly ever angered. And so he goes in April of 1917, he goes to the United States Congress and says, look, they've been shooting down our ships, they've been killing Americans, and now they're trying to get our neighbors to attack us. And he said that was enough. We got to do something about this. So he goes to war and asks for a declaration of war against the Germans. Now, it's a little different, though, in the United States because, you know, if you ask a British soldier or a French soldier or a Australian soldier or any of those fighting on the side of the Triple Entente, if you ask them, why are you fighting this war, World War I don't know what the answer would be. You know, is it about the Archduke getting assassinated? Is it just because you hate the Germans or poor little Belgium? Or it's hard to find the actual reason why the war is being fought. But Woodrow Wilson does not want to make this mistake. And so when he asks for a declaration of war, he says the reason the United States is going to war is to make the world safe for democracy. And this kind of pumps people up. It inspires people and inspires Americans to rally around the president, to rally around this cause of not to get involved in some stupid little war going on in Europe, but really to change the world as we knew it so that the health and the future of democracy would be strong for many years to come after the war. Now, there are a couple things that also happened in 1917. There's a couple Russian revolutions. If you remember, Russia is ruled by a Tsar, and the Tsar really didn't want to be the leader of Russia, and he wasn't really running the war very well anyways. And so there was a movement that started from a bread riot. A bunch of women in Moscow and St. Petersburg got together and held a protest for the lack of food that they had. And those protests kind of grew and grew and grew until finally they asked the Tsar to abdicate, meaning to step down from the throne. And he was like, fine, you know what? I don't want to do this anyways. Sure, find a new government. That would be fine. And so a new government was formed after that was the first Russian Revolution in March of 1917. A new socialist democracy was formed. Now, this didn't go so well. I mean, there was still people who were hungry, and the war was still going on. That's one big mistake that this new government in Russia made, was keeping the war going on the Eastern Front. And so while this new government struggled from March until October of 1917, Vladimir Lenin, who had been the leader of the Bolshevik movement that you learned about in week 1 in this class, he had been exiled to Switzerland. And the Germans were like, you know what, Mr. Lenin, why don't we help you get from Switzerland back to Russia, and maybe you can work on some sort of revolution to get a new government in Russia that would end the war in Germany. And that's exactly what he did. In October of 1917, a small group of soldiers loyal to Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, which later will become the Communists, they got together and overthrew the weak socialist democracy that had been in existence since March of 1917. Once Vladimir Lenin became the leader of Russia in October of 1917, he negotiated with the Germans to end the war on the Eastern Front in something called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And so the Russians and the Germans came to a peace agreement, and the war on the Eastern Front was over even before the United States had ever gotten into the game. We do start sending troops in, though, and you know, we're kind of reluctant to get involved in the battles because the French and the British certainly have not had a good track record of winning battles in World War I on the Western Front with trench warfare. And so our military commander, a guy named Blackjack Pershing, he kind of was reluctant to put Americans into the battle, but we finally did get involved in the one and only major battle that we fought in World War I. It's called the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, and we did all right. I mean, we didn't do great. We didn't really roll over the Germans, but we inflicted enough casualties on the Germans that they kind of retreated, and we realized that this was not going to be an easy thing. But that was in 1918, and the war was almost over anyway. So we didn't play that big a role in the fighting of World War II, certainly not as big as we did in World War II, where we kind of carried the brunt of the fighting both in Europe and in the Pacific. But in World War I, it was the future that people were afraid of. You know, here, if the war keeps going on and suddenly we have 1 million American soldiers coming over, that spelled defeat for the Germans because they certainly could not keep up with that. And so the war is going to wind down, not because of what America does, but by what America could have done if the war continued. So we have some questions for you to look at, some readings as well. I have some speeches for you to listen to here in week 3, module 1. These are the voices. What you'll be listening to are the voices of the leaders of World War I. And I think it's fascinating to listen to the emotion in their voice, or the lack of it in some cases, and see what they really have to say. And then we're going to analyze what they said, why they said it, with a little chart that we have borrowed from the Library of Congress. And you'll post your results. Actually, you'll email the results straight to me, and we'll post them as well. So that's week 3, module 1. Enjoy the speeches. Please be a deep thinker when you're analyzing these speeches, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.